Hello everyone, this is Fionapollo and I do art commentary. And today's topic is a look into a trope that I haven't seen for quite a while, but every so often you get reminded of it and you're just like, oh yeah, that was a thing. And that is the world of female counterpart characters in cartoons. So this is a trend that felt like it was pretty popular from around the 80s to the early 2000s, and has since died down considerably due to a number of different factors. It was a very common trope with non-human characters especially as a way to differentiate males and females in a given species, and it was also commonly used as a way to create a romantic subplot when other established female candidates were, lacking. It's no secret that a lot of these female counterparts didn't have much going for them. They are often interpreted as being very derivative from the original male character's design. They appeared very sparingly, often as some form of distraction or even as an antagonist to foil the main character, and their personalities were also pretty one note as well. There are of course exceptions to that, as there always is for any given thing, but as a generalization, it feels like this is a trope that people like to reminisce about for nostalgia's sake, but from what I've gathered when asking people about this topic, most appear pretty happy to see the back of it. There's a lot of debate around the perceived impact of these characters. Some people loved them, some people hated them, some just really don't care, which is also valid. So I wanted to explore that with you all today. I wanted to take a look into the whole deal around this trope, where it came from, what implications it had on both cartoons and the people who grew up on them, whether they were ever really that bad, or if they were truly the pinnacle of cringe male to female dynamics in children's media, what can possibly be taken away from it, and so much more. I honestly remember not really minding these characters all that much, since in my experience growing up in that time, as a young girl, it was often just a win to see any female characters at all sometimes in certain shows, especially when animation at that time was still a pretty male-dominated industry. I don't think personally this was a big intentional plot of the patriarchy or anything like that, it was just how things were at the time, but it'll be interesting to look at that side of things among others, I believe. If you like what you're hearing, please consider liking and subscribing. Do you know of any examples of this trope that stuck with you? What did you take away from it if you grew up with it? And do you think it has an important place in cartoon history today? Please let me know, any feedback is greatly appreciated. Alright, let's do this! Part 1. Cartoons, Comics and Toys. Oh my. So for context on this, let's brush up on a little bit of history. I couldn't actually find many videos or articles or anything looking into the history behind this trope specifically, so a lot of this is going to be me kind of speculating and trying to piece things together, so just be aware of that. Back in the very early days of hand-drawn animation, a lot of the rubber hose characters were designed to be extremely simple so that the animators could put more emphasis on their movements. Couple that with the fact that a large portion of these characters were walking, talking animals, this meant that for the most part there was virtually zero distinction between non-human characters without certain indicators. This posed a problem if, for example, an animator wanted to create a funny scene of a young couple getting into some silly antics together, but the audience might perceive that as homosexuality, because remember, this was the 1920s. So, in order to communicate to the audience that one was a boy and one was a girl, animators would give their girl characters minimal characteristics to reflect this, and these would mostly show through in costuming. A cute hair bow, frilly dress, and some heels were the popular choice. The biggest and best example of this is none other than Mickey and Minnie Mouse. Both of them are very clearly boy and girl with those indicators in mind, but if you took the clothes away, the only indication we have that Minnie is the girl mouse is her eyelashes, and even then, they aren't always shown in every iteration of her. Back in this period, these choices were very advantageous and served a clear purpose that felt like it made sense for the nature of the product at the time. Fast forward a bit, and this is where this concept seems to skew slightly. Following Disney's rise to prominence with their animated features, it became more common to apply this line of thinking to characters that had more intricate designs than what was used in the rubber hose era, and instead drew inspiration from cartoons where human male and female characters were very distinct. Think Betty Boop and Popeye, for example. Both are very clearly drawn to be exaggerated examples of women and men, and this is where we end up with Tom from Tom and Jerry being very clearly a boy cat next to any feline character that gets shown in a one-off episode when Tom gets distracted from chasing Jerry. We also need to remember that in the 90s to, I think, the early 50s, cartoon character designs were also very reminiscent of caricatures because this helped to further exaggerate the character's wacky movements and behaviours, which in turn worked better with getting the audience to suspend their belief and laugh along with what was happening on screen. But as animation evolved and storytellers began to dabble in creating more dramatic and serious narratives while still playing into the lightheartedness that animation can bring, they tried to find a middle ground to this within their character designs. Proportions and detailing became more realistic than before, but certain aspects such as faces and mannerisms were still made to be cartoonish to communicate this. In the 80s and 90s especially, it felt like we ended up with this really weird mix of heartfelt narratives and stories, combined with certain designs that could very vary from, okay, yeah, this dog is wearing makeup, but it works, to, oh my god, why does this goose have bedroom eyes and boobs? Personally, I think one of the reasons for this is because in the 80s, much like how the Hays Code came in but started to be largely rejected in the 60s, big-name comic publishers like Marvel and DC started to break away from the Comics Code Authority as well, which was a voluntary association that was used in place of governmental regulation in the Western comic book industry. This was important, I think, because creative sectors do tend to take note of what trends are happening in each of them and use that to influence their own works. And when the Comics Code Authority was abandoned, all of a sudden you had this explosion of new material appearing within comics now that many restrictions had been lifted. And that cross-population of viewers who read comics and watched cartoons would be drawn to cartoons that followed similar narratives to their favourite comics. And also there was the fact that the kids who grew up with comic books in the 60s and 70s were now growing up, getting into animation and adapting their favourite comics into cartoons, much like how these same comics are being adapted into cinematic universes on the big screen today. This also in turn meant that while it allowed for a lot more creative freedom, it also meant that things could be dialed up to the extreme with little to no restraint, and one of those things was the visual exaggeration and sexualization of female characters. I personally can't say for sure whether this is true, it's just me speculating, but I also don't think it's that wild of a concept. Even though cartoons were never quite as overt as comics in that department because they still had censors from TV, I think this shift in the comics industry lit a bit of a flame under other industries and incited them to be a bit more daring, for better or for worse. What also added to that is that in the 1980s, toy manufacturing and merchandising exploded as well, which led to many franchises like He-Man, She-Ra, Power Rangers and Transformers and many others to receive cartoon adaptations with the express purpose of promoting and selling toys like action figures. Because the toy market was very much geared towards younger children, the designs for these action figures and dolls needed to be similar enough that they could be mass-produced, but distinct enough that children could easily tell all of the characters apart. And the best way to do that oftentimes was to just swap the colours around. So this is where I believe this trope of making a girl character the same as the boy but pink was at its most beneficial to consumers and companies alike. By the 90s, you could pretty much guarantee that this was the reason certain characters in a Disney movie or TV show, for example, would look a certain way. The best 90s example I can think of at the moment is a movie Saberspark recently spoke about, Balto. It is so obvious which non-human characters are boys and which are girls in this film, and you can also really tell which of these designs is meant to be taken more seriously and which is comic relief because of how exaggerated they are. And while the 80s and 90s were kind of the peak of this trope, it continued on even up until the 2010s with examples like the How to Train Your Dragon series. Light Fury and Toothless are prime examples of characters being designed with toy sales in mind, but with that said, as far as TV and film are concerned, the trope has really died down, and that's probably for a few key reasons. The first being that more women have entered more fields of employment that were traditionally very male-dominated and essentially overhauled the way many people saw these types of characters. This isn't just in creative fields, it's also in places like the sciences and coding and, well, everywhere. And just having women existing in those spaces has really helped break down this perception of the idea that only men or women can do certain things or present in a certain way. And it's the same for if, say, a man wants to be a social worker or a stay-at-home husband or even, a makeup influencer or something, I don't know. The other factor is that more adults are watching animation now, so the standards for everything, including character design and direction, have risen. Even though small children have enjoyed these characters and grew up with some residual nostalgia, people's tastes and values often change as they grow, and with something as dated as all women having to be decked out in pink and obsessed with a guy, it was kind of inevitable that this trope would die down eventually. And it's not even like those things are bad, it's just that it was used repeatedly and people just got bored. New generations of viewers always bring with them a change of ideas and preferences, and this was just one of them. Another thing that likely switched things up was the shift from standalone episodes to more serialized narratives, and this can go hand in hand with streaming as well. Characters can afford to be a bit one-dimensional in standalone episodes for traditional TV because that's the point. So there was never really any need for these female counterparts to be anything more than main character but pink. But when more structured narratives took over, people wanted more development and substance from them, and for some this was a phenomenally good thing. This trend also occurred in games too. Amy Rose from the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, for example, was originally interpreted as a pink hedgehog like Sonic whose whole personality was that she was in love with him, but after appearing in the comics, TV shows, games, receiving her own character arcs, having flaws, ambitions and achievements throughout the years, she went on to become a fan favourite of the series in her own right. So while we do still get female counterparts from time to time, the change in standards and rationalisation for these characters to look and behave a certain way has shifted dramatically. We've proven over the years that female characters can have different personalities and appearances, but there will always be a soft spot in people's hearts for the characters they grew up with and a longing for them to have more to their identity, and not to necessarily wipe that aspect of it away. Again, it's not like the concept itself is wholly unacceptable, but variety is the spice of life, and that kind of ended up up being the catalyst for this trope's decline. People wanted to see these characters develop and change, so they did. But anyway, that's enough of our history portion. Let's go into how people interpreted these characters and the perceived impact this had both on them and the industry. Part 2. Implications and impact. So even though we've established some possibilities for why this trope came about, just because we might know how it came to be doesn't exactly mean that it's free from consequences. Any trope, idea, dynamic, or theme in media will always carry some positive and negative aspects. I went ahead and asked my audience as usual what their thoughts were on the trope of female counterpart characters, and while a good few mentioned that they enjoyed these characters due to nostalgia or other factors that I will get into later on, there were also quite a few negatives that I want to get through first. The first and most obvious is that these character designs often feel remarkably uncreative and very akin to a recolor of the main protagonist. Looking at the aesthetics here and not the character's personality, we have Amy Rose from Sonic, Angel from Lilo and Stitch, Robot Girl from Robot Boy, and Light Fury from How to Train Your Dragon, to name a few. A change in colour itself is not that big of a deal, and oftentimes they actually look quite nice, but the issue many people had with this trope is that these characters were almost always pink, and if they weren't pink, they were often another soft feminine colour such as pale yellow or white. Now, this can have a whole host of implications. A lot of the time when you have a character covered head to toe in the colour pink, historically this was used as a shorthand for hinting that this character cares very much about their appearance and not much else, which was also historically interpreted by audiences to mean that this character was vain, ditzy, flirtatious, and a whole host of other derogatory adjectives. Going hand in hand with that, these characters were also designed to have characteristics that were deemed as attractive in humans, even if that didn't really make sense for the species that character was. A prime example we have for this is the introduction of Lola Bunny in Space Jam. In the 80s and 90s, a big thing with these characters is that this trope was very heavily steeped in lookism. With very few exceptions, these female characters were almost always designed to be attractive, and this also lended itself to them appearing very sexualized as well. And I do want to keep stressing that there is nothing wrong with an attractive female character, but it's a bit like the playable character argument in video games. We just want variety. I'm honestly glad that things are slightly better now. There's still a lot to reflect and work on, but I think this trope really stunted people's ability to depict women as having things like other body types, personal styles that veered away from looking attractive, and even race played into it too. The female counterpart character often had whiter skin or a paler colour palette overall compared to the male protagonist, and this unfortunately lended itself to some very unfair perceptions of what makes the characters attractive, oftentimes veering into racist or colourist territory. When looking into the personality side of things, these characters often tended to have this kind of femme fatale quality to them. Angel from Lilo and Stitch, for example, would often manipulate Stitch into getting what she wants from him because she knows he can't say no to her. Same with Scrat's squirrel girlfriend in the Ice Age. She would often use her feminine wiles to rob Scrat's acorn and make off with it. Even though these instances can be fun and goofy, honestly I still laugh at Scrat. The core implication here is that women will use their attractiveness to manipulate people, which, you know, some do, I guess, but the majority don't, and that's not really something we should be telling young boys and girls. And finally, all of these things combined didn't really help with fighting back against traditional gender roles either. It's not bad to have female characters who love the colour pink or dream of being a stay-at-home wife or anything like that, but again, people don't want that all the time, and reflecting only that one aspect of femininity is kind of harmful. We need to remember that a lot of these characters were made for kids' movies or TV shows. We obviously know as adults or even teenagers that you don't have to adhere to these stereotypes, but children will just soak up anything you put in front of them, which is why with kids media you need to kind of understand that these things can and will be taken at face value, and for a good chunk of people, those face values never really go away, which can go in one or two directions. Either they know they have the options and proceed with this mold of what a woman should be anyway, which is fine because then it's their choice, or they try to force themselves to fit into it, which is often also born out of pressure from people around them to do so too. But was that ever the intent of these characters? Was this trapping of the patriarchy done on purpose? Personally, I don't think it was, or at the least not all the time. Maybe in a few very, very obvious instances, but there's also the implication that these characters were often created with the knowledge that there isn't really a big pool of female characters in the show anyway, but the people writing them didn't really have the understanding of how to write something different and instead opted to draw upon what they already knew of from past media. Either that, or they weren't allowed to. And the reason they did so was because for so many years prior, it worked. That's why certain animators, showrunners, writers, and other creatives express that they have so much difficulty when trying to introduce new types of characters or new concepts, only for an executive or someone to fight against it. When Disney's Encanto was released, executives were convinced that Isabella, the conventionally pretty and feminine Madrigal sister, would be preferred by young children and make for better toy sales. But in the film, Isabella was constantly belittling and scoffing at her younger sister. Meanwhile, Louisa, being very tall and muscular, was was instead shown in a more favourable light, and right off the bat ended up getting more demand for toys and merchandising than what Disney had accounted for. When you have more than one female character in any given media, appearance starts to become less of a deciding factor on which characters people will prefer. And one more factor that I think is pretty funny is that when you look into it, little girls aren't the biggest demographic that these female counterpart characters appeal to. I've kind of found that queer people tend to love these characters more so. Obviously, you have the whole stereotype that gay men like them, but I'll let you in on a little queer secret here. Straight women aren't the ones decking themselves out head to toe in pink, my dudes. Like seriously, look at these characters and tell me you don't get an aura of camp emanating from them, come on. Anyway, I think that's it for this section. I've had my feminist rant, so I'm satisfied. Let's wrap things up, shall we? Part 3. Is it still a problem? I would say not majorly anymore, since shows and films seem to have largely moved past it for the most part. Again, I think that's probably a combination of viewership standards changing, and I assume a higher percentage of women and minorities becoming more present and visible on production crews who are actually able to write and better empathise with different kinds of people. I also have a feeling that the decline of this trope is due to the fact that women in the 21st century are also becoming much more financially independent and are actually earning more than men in some instances, so this kind of depiction of a sultry feminine creature who uses men for their resources doesn't really apply anymore. Like, obviously some women do that, but it's not really reflective of an entire group of people, and it never really was in the first place. It feels more akin to an outdated perception of the past now. But regardless, I don't strictly think these characters are bad. Some are entertaining, some are just of their time. Some, such as Amy and Lola, were allowed to develop and become beloved by fans, and some even subverted the trope. Blue from Blue's Clues is actually a girl dog and Magenta is a boy. It happens. You're not like anti-feminist or a misogynist or a bad person for liking these characters either. Anyone who says that is just silly. As I've said, variety is the spice of life, and I'm just glad that the Barbies and Nebulas in media can now exist simultaneously. But anyway, that's all from me, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. What did you think of this one? Do you agree with what I said? Is there anything I missed out or that you wish I'd mentioned? Please let me know. Stay safe, everyone. Bye!